I'd like to welcome Rachel Meyer. Rachel will be discussing the topic, how can the transplant system be improved for patients? Rachel is the Strategic Policy Advisor to the Executive Vice President at the American Society of Nephrology, focusing on ASN's transplant policy strategy across legislative and regulatory arenas. In her prior role at ASN as the Senior Director of Policy and Government Affairs, she oversaw the Society's federal advocacy portfolio, including Congress and federal CMS, FDA, and NIH, working to influence policies that affect kidney health, research, and innovation. She helped shape the presidential executive order on advancing American kidney health, and more recently is focused on the HRSA Modernization Initiative. Her roles have included serving as Deputy Chief of Staff for Project ECHO, as a researcher at the Advisory Board Company, and in the office of Senator Ken Salazar. With that, welcome, Rachel, and I will pass it on to you. And I'm happy to help you in any way to get your slides up. So let's see.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Isella, Lori, Suzette, Cher. It's so exciting to be here. I'm going to try to perform a feat of moderate technical difficulty and share my own slides. So just bear with me while I attempt to get these up here. It's going to take several clicks. All right. Well, as you all heard, I'm Rachel Meyer. I'm with the American Society of Nephrology, and I'm so excited and honored to have this opportunity to talk with you all today. ASN and the Renal Support Network have a long history of collaboration, including on a number of the policy-related topics in the transplant arena that we're about to talk about today. So, for those of you who are not familiar with ASN, we are a health professional organization representing nephrologists, scientists, and other health professionals. And our mission as an organization is to create a world without kidney diseases. To understand a little bit about the philosophy that guides us as ASN, I encourage you to read, and I won't read it to you, the mantra on the far right-hand side of the slide here. As you can see, we really try to orient kind of our organizational decision-making and philosophy by asking and answering, asking and answering these questions, starting with, most importantly, what is best for people living with kidney diseases and their families? So the vision for a better transplant system and a lot of the work that's gone into it that I'm going to talk about today is definitely not my own. This is a reflection of the work of many leaders and some of my colleagues at ASN who I'm privileged to work with, listed on the slide here today. Let me just do a sound check and a vision check. Is everything sounding and looking good to you guys?
Before yes, everything sounds and looks great, Rachel.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So this is what we're going to be talking about for the next, say 43 minutes or so. I won't read this roadmap, but what I want to do is kind of talk about what is our transplant system, how can we make it better, and what's currently going on in government that's actually helping to start make it better. But perhaps most importantly, I want to end on discussing with all of you what you can do to help and contribute in a discussion. Okay. So today, Lori has asked me to talk largely about the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network. OPTN is the name of an acronym for our nation's transplant system. The OPTN, for those of you who aren't familiar, is probably what you think about, even though you don't know it when you think about our nation's transplant system. It is made up of a membership of transplant centers, organ procurement organizations who are really responsible for procuring organs, some of the labs that do transplant work, and others. As you can see from this slide, which I borrowed from a government agency called the Health Resources and Service Administration, which is where the transplant system lives, OPTN is made up of a couple different functions, and it does many things. It matches organs to patients. It makes policy about how we match organs to patients. It monitors safety and compliance. It maintains a large data registry, and it operates all of the underlying information technology infrastructure that makes all those parts work. So the OPTN is really several big jobs kind of rolled into one. Today, the OPTN is operated and run by one contractor, kind of shown in the lower left side of the slide here in the orange box, UNOS. I'm sure you all have heard of it. And there are also other government agencies besides HRSA that have a role to play in kidney transplantation, particularly the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which covers payment and other aspects of oversight. So what I think this government slide does a really good job of showing is the architecture of where the OPTN sits within HHS. What I think it does a less good job of showing, and something we're going to talk about today, is where all of you fit, where patients and families and caregivers fit in the system. Regrettably, you're kind of over on the side when really patients should be at the center of what our organ transplant system is doing and focusing on. Over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, we're going to talk about some of the coming changes that ASN, RSN, and other advocates are pressing for that will kind of move patients and families from over here right to over here at the center of the focus of our system. So I was asked to talk about how we can improve the transplant system. But before we get down to brass tacks on changes, I think we need to define the goals. What is it that we're working toward in this system? I propose that we keep the answer to this question pretty simple. We at ASN believe that there are really two key things that the entire OPTN should orient towards serving. And first, it's maximizing patients' access to getting a kidney transplant, the best possible therapy for most people. And second, making sure that every patient, regardless of where they live, what their background is, how much money they have or make, who they are, also has equal access to that optimal therapy. So now let's talk about how we achieve those goals. What are we already doing well? Well, the US transplant system has a lot of incredible attributes that we should all be proud of. First of all, it's the largest organ transplantation system in the entire world, and we're a beacon of hope in that regard. This system is also growing. As you can see from the exciting stats on this slide, we're transplanting more patients than ever. And this year, we're on track to exceed last year's numbers as well. Something else I think is important to highlight is that in 2023, we're transplanting people who 20, 30 years ago would never have even been considered as a possible transplant candidate. But thanks to advancements in science and research, we now have a broader pool of the people who can not only be considered, but also live a healthy life with a new kidney. But we also have a long way to go. Let's spend a little time unpacking on what's on this slide. I would summarize it by saying, not only can we see from these statistics that there's unmet need, that unmet need isn't just about the organ shortage. It's also about how we're managing the supply of organs that we have and how we support, or in some cases, maybe miss opportunities to support people who might benefit from getting a kidney transplant. So we see that there are about 90,000 Americans who are waitlisted for a kidney, but tragically, evidence suggests that there are likely many more people who would benefit, who never make it to the waitlist, never have a shot at getting a kidney at all. Indeed, a recent peer-reviewed journal article showed that about half of healthy, with no other comorbidities, dialysis patients under the age of 40 are never waitlisted. I think that fact should shock and frustrate us all and motivate us to get involved because we can do better. In addition, 10,000 Americans die waiting for a kidney annually, but we're not using 1 in 4 kidneys that are procured. And people who die waiting have been offered, on average, 16 kidneys that were declined, often without their knowledge. Plus, evidence suggests that many people who were once waitlisted were removed, even though they probably would have been good candidates to get a kidney anyway. We also know that transplant is less equitable for many subsets of Americans. That's why increasing equity and access to transplant is a top goal for ASN. Meanwhile, living donation rates have not increased in recent years. We all know that we can and must do more to support living donors, and I know that's something that RSN in particular does a tremendous job of achieving. But where to begin applying solutions to all these problems that I just laid out? We're kind of confronted with somewhat of a circular set of questions, and I think this is one of the reasons, this circular nature, that we haven't previously maybe made more changes or progress? Do we begin by focusing on boosting organ supply and demanding better performance from organ procurement organizations? But will the supply be used if it grows? Do we need to start by demanding changes in how transplant centers make decisions and prioritizing patient engagement? Or do we focus on increasing access and making sure that everybody who would benefit from being waitlisted is waitlisted? But a skeptic might say, well, what good do we do? What does that do if we don't have enough organs to go around? So maybe we tackle the supply issue by innovating our way out of it. Well, promising things like xenotransplantation are on their way, but they're probably still several years out, which kind of brings us right back to where we started. Now, this might sound a little negative, but I personally am incredibly excited and optimistic that we're on the cusp of a lot of changes that are going to fix all of these problems at once. And here, I propose that we take inspiration from another circular situation, one of my personal favorites, the everything bagel. This beautiful circle works so well. And why does it work so well? Well, it has many ingredients for success that are all going on at once. You don't have to wait for your crunchy sesame while you're getting your savory onion flakes. No one is saying we couldn't possibly tackle the addition of the poppy seeds before we get to the flaky sea salt. No, the everything bagel knows that to be its best self, it needs many things all at once. And that's precisely what we need from our transplant system right now. Many simultaneous changes to boost patient access and make sure that that access is equitable. Traditionally, there are 5 spices that top this glorious everything bagel I'm talking about. So taking inspiration from its 5 spices, I'm going to outline 5 broad ingredients or objectives for change that we at ASN believe we need to see in our transplant system. I'm going to give some examples of what those policy changes might entail to achieve those objectives, and most importantly, talk about how I think we're actually on our way to achieving them through the work of Congress, the federal government, and stakeholders like those represented during today's discussion. Here we go. Ingredient for change, or objective 1. We need to expedite the reforms that we know would help maximize patients' access to transplantation. Patients deserve a coordinated, government-wide, ecosystem-wide approach that allows all stakeholders to work together to maximize access. And the clear government opportunities that exist should be implemented. For example, where government policy is out of alignment with itself, that needs to change. Where government policy is out of alignment with known best practices, that needs to change. And where government policy is out of alignment with current science, you guessed it, that also needs to change. So, what might that entail? As one example, today, the board responsible for overseeing the government contractor that runs the transplant system, OPTN, is also the contractor's board. They're identical. It's a little bit of a fox guarding the henhouse situation. But by having separate boards, one to oversee the function of the system, and other boards for contractors that run it on a day-to-day basis who work so hard and put so much into doing that on behalf of patients, is just basic good governance. And that's a reform that we can and will see coming soon that will help create accountability in our transplant system. All right, ingredient number 2. Sorry, I clicked myself ahead here. Ingredient number 2, transparency. I would venture to guess that many of you in this virtual room can speak personally to the lack of transparency in the transplant system. It is a multi-step process that is kind of notoriously difficult to navigate. I don't think anyone is to blame here. It's simply that the system as it currently exists is not set up or supported by appropriate technology to really be very transparent and navigable. Many of the nephrologists that we at ASN represent liken the system to a black box. Patient information goes in, but patient information rarely comes back out. And our members are left wondering how best they can help their patients navigate to get to that ultimate goal, the wait list and a kidney transplant. But we can do better, and the government is working towards that. So an example of a policy change would help create that type of transparency I'm talking about is, as an example, and there are more, providing waitlisted patients standardized, predictable updates about their status on the waitlist, or maybe organs that were offered and declined on their behalf. Patients deserve a chance to be leaders in their own care and have more input about decisions made on their behalf. It may not be possible to do all of this in real time, but by providing standardized updates and making that a requirement of our transplant system, we can foster conversations and create space for that critical dialogue between patients and their transplant care teams. I urge you all to think about, would we still be failing to use 1 in 4 kidneys if patients knew they were being declined on their behalf? Third ingredient for change, we need to use more organs. As I referenced earlier, we talk a lot about the organ shortage, and it is real. But we also have to recognize that one of the contributing factors to that shortage is our collective failure to efficiently use the supply that we have, and at the same time, to optimally support living donors. So what we need is policy changes that foster more organ use and make that a goal of all the stakeholders in the system, and to better empower living donors. Yolanda, thank you for the shout out on transparency. Okay, next up. Okay, so sorry, I'm getting myself twisted between the chat and my slides here. So what might a policy change that would allow us to use more organs to allow more patients to get a transplant look like? Currently, the government metrics that are used to evaluate transplant programs are, frankly, in some cases at odds with our goal of maximizing access and using more organs. A commonly cited culprit for lack of organ use is that transplant programs are made by the current government metrics to feel risk averse, because those metrics ask for incredibly high standards and the stakes for failing to meet them are high. Even though almost any transplanted kidney from the patient perspective is going to offer better quality of life and survival as compared to dialysis. So for some transplant programs out there, there is an understandable reluctance to accept some organs because it might place that program at a greater risk for being graded by the government as a low performer. Again, despite the overall survival advantage that a given kidney might offer an individual patient. We also know that programs that get labeled as low performing on these metrics are less likely to add more people to their wait lists, and they're more likely to remove them, as we saw on an earlier slide. The bottom line is we need more patient-centered metrics and metrics that allow transplant centers to focus on maximizing access, in contrast to the ones we have today. Ingredient 4. We need to invest in more research, and that is a top ASN advocacy goal. Yeah, you're probably thinking, well, Rachel, this is a goal. This seems fairly obvious. I think we all know that belatacept was the last new drug approved for kidney transplant recipients, and that was in 2011. That's coming up on 15 years ago. Patients deserve better and newer therapies. But what may be less obvious is the need not only to invest in research, which is critical, but also to coordinate that research within the National Institutes of Health, where kidney transplantation research doesn't currently have a home, and at the same time, to align all of the government agencies with a role to play in helping patients access the optimal quality, innovative therapies, such as FDA, which ultimately approves them, and CMS, which actually needs to ultimately pay for them. That's why we at ASN have started to call for the creation, or at least exploring the creation, of an HHS Office of Kidney Health and Transplantation, one locus at the top of the department that would make sure that every agency with a role to play in kidney health and transplantation is working in sync to benefit patients, including to make sure they get access to innovative new therapies. Our 5th ingredient here, embracing modern technology. Our transplant systems, technology, and data infrastructure are, no pun intended, woefully dated. By bringing the underlying technology that supports all of those important functions I described on the first slide into the 21st century, that is a foundational step to making our whole system more efficient, more transparent, and more equitable. All right. So what would a policy change that exemplifies this ingredient or objective look like? Well, implementing a modern IT infrastructure would allow us to do things like move away from our reliance on fax machines and manual data entry. Not only is it wildly inefficient and error-prone, I think we can all agree that the transplant professionals at transplant centers probably have better things to do with their time than send faxes. A modern technology system would also allow us to better use analytics to make more informed predictions about, say, which organ would be the best fit for a patient for the long term. It also means we could stop losing organs in transit, and while rare, it really should hardly ever be happening. When I order a pizza from Uber Eats, or maybe in this example, it's an everything bagel that I'm ordering, I can track it to my doorstep, and our donated kidneys deserve nothing less. Embracing modern technology can help us get there. Okay, so let's just take a minute to kind of recap the themes that we just talked about that are in my list of 5 ingredients to achieve our goals of maximizing patients' access and ensuring that access is equitable. We've got good governance and accountability in our transplant system, transparency for patients, and prioritizing a flow of information to help them and their families navigate the system and make decisions. We need the whole government aligned to serve patients first and foremost. We also need to be increasing our organ use, both by supporting living donors and more efficiently using our deceased donor supply. By adopting modern technology and fresh approaches to our OPTN, we can do all these things. And the government is actually doing quite a lot towards working towards them right now, which is the second half of my presentation. So, those themes we just went over, this summer, the United States Congress took a huge step towards actually making them possible by passing, on a very bipartisan basis, this legislation, the Securing U.S. OPTN Act. I know it's not going to win any prizes for best name ever, but stick with me. President Biden signed this bill into law just a few weeks ago. And it's going to do 4 key things that really open up the possibility for the Biden-Harris administration to do a lot of the things we want. First of all, it eliminates a kind of archaic rule that says that the contractor who holds the OPTN contract has to have prior experience in the OPTN contract. You can see why that might have led to a lack of competition and new ideas for the OPTN contract. This law also allows the government to, rather than having just one contractor running our entire complex, multifaceted organ transplant system, to consider multiple contractors or bidders with unique niche expertise. So again, this is bringing fresh ideas and creating competition to make sure that transplant patients and transplant candidates are being served by the best in class. It also strikes a really old cap that Congress put on itself in its infinite wisdom about how much money the government can actually spend on our organ transplant system technology. By getting rid of this cap, the government now has the flexibility to actually invest appropriately, the way that it probably should have been for a while, in making sure that we're modernizing the infrastructure. And last but certainly not least, remember ingredient 1, it specifies that that contractors have to have different boards than the one that oversees them. So no more fox guarding the hen house. Well, I think these images speak for themselves. Clearly, Congress is not super happy with the way the system is currently serving transplant patients, and it wants to see the types of changes that we've talked about. So you can bet that the senators shown on this screen are going to be keeping a very close eye on what the Biden-Harris administration does moving forward as they implement this law and other changes that the administration has in the works. So what are those changes? Well, earlier this year, the administration unveiled something called the OPTN, again, the Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network Modernization Initiative. In a nutshell, this is the biggest single change or set of changes, group of changes, in about 30 years to the transplant system. And the government's stated goal is to strengthen accountability, equity, and overall performance in the donation and transplantation system. I think ASN President Michelle Josephson said it well. This modernization initiative is a foundational step, not the last, but it's a foundational one, towards improving transparency and efficiency of the entire kidney health ecosystem. And we're excited. Here you can see Secretary Javier Becerra and HRSA Administrator Carol Johnson out on the road, highlighting their personal focus and the administration's commitment to increasing transparency, to implementing reforms, and modernizing our transplant network so it better serves patients. Let's dive a little deeper. What is this modernization initiative that I'm so excited about? Well, this is the second slide in this deck that I have borrowed from the federal government. And this is HRSA, this is the government, describing the modernization initiative in its own words. And if you can see the type in this little blue box, I think these really are the goals or the themes that we would want to see. Putting patients first, prioritizing information flow to patients and clinicians, embracing innovation, and again, you're probably sick of hearing me say these words, transparency and accountability. The government has outlined 5 pillars of how they're going to do that through this initiative. So let's talk about what that might mean in a bit more specificity. First off, a focus on technology. Let's not use faxes anymore. Let's invest as the government in cloud-based and more automated information technology. Data analytics. How can we process the vast and incredible OPTN registry and all the data about transplant patients and candidates who have come before us to harness it and make better decisions, use predictive analytics in ways that we're not currently? There's some really exciting things I think we can do through this data analytics objective. Third, governance. Once again, 2 separate boards, contractors don't oversee themselves. I think we can all agree on that at this point. Operations. In my mind, this is really where things get interesting. One of the stated goals of the OPTN Modernization Initiative's operations pillar is that they can update policies of the OPTN where they maybe aren't working, maybe aren't serving patients best. I think a great place to start would be looking at metrics to replace some of those that I just talked about, that grade transplant centers in ways that maybe make it harder for them to optimally help patients access kidney transplantation. So new metrics would be a great place to start. Last but not least, innovation. I think what we're seeing here is the federal government really embracing the concept that we need new ideas. We need new ways of doing business to continue to improve our transplant system that has served so many and really well to bring it into the 21st century. But I've buried the lead here because I think what is actually the most important thing about this government slide is that in the vision for the new OPTN, the modernized OPTN, who is at the center? Patients and their families. All of these changes are revolving around patients and families, as they should, to prioritize their needs and put them first. So no longer are we looking at organ transplant community and stakeholders off to the side. In my mind, the modernization initiative means a system that puts patients and families at the center of what they're doing. Another, another important element to the modernization initiative is that instead of one monolithic contract encompassing really a bunch of different and very technical jobs, the government now has the opportunity to divide up some of the tasks to make sure that patients are served by the best in class for each one. Maybe one contractor will win them all. Maybe 5 different contractors will win them. It remains to be seen, but the point is that the government now has a legal flexibility, thanks to that law that got passed earlier this year, to consider multiple options. So these changes are actually coming pretty soon. This fall, the government's going to ask for bids on new contracts. There is, a detailed transition plan that is going to go on for years to come so that the government makes sure that these changes are implemented carefully. So while the complete shift definitely won't happen overnight, it begins very soon. Okay, you might be thinking, well, Rachel, you're talking about this potentially beautiful new system that's being planned or envisioned for the coming years, and what about that organ supply? Well, on this slide and the next, I'm going to talk about some initiatives that are happening on the Hill and in the administration to address that very question. So in the past, organ procurement organizations could, to simplify, kind of grade their own performance, and none of them ever lost a contract. But now there's a new uniform grading system that the government is going to be using that will create more accountability to make sure that all organ procurement organizations across the country are optimally serving their communities, or if they're not, they can learn from those who are doing really well and improve how they're serving their communities. Those who don't perform will ultimately have to face consequences or competition because patients deserve nothing less than, the highest performing OPOs out there. But it's not just about the deceased donation supply. No. We also need to do a much better job as a country supporting our living donors. And again, I want to give a shout out to RSN because you have done some tremendous work and continue to do some tremendous work in this arena. At this time, Congress is also working on legislation to try to do just that, which is clearly an unmet need. You're probably all familiar with the Living Donor Protection Act, which RSN has been a great advocate for. So I want to focus your attention on a piece of legislation that will be dropped, as they say, on the Hill in the coming days, the Honor Our Living Donors, or the HOLD Act. No one should face out-of-pocket expenses to become a living donor and give the gift of life. What this bill, the HOLD Act, aims to do would be to make sure that the government determines whether living donors are eligible to receive government money to cover their donation-related expenses based on their income. You might be wondering, that sounds fairly obvious. Crazy as it may sound, currently, under law, the government can only living donors can only be reimbursed if the recipient of their organ qualifies. That really doesn't make any sense. So by making sure that we're looking to the donor themselves to be eligible for reimbursement, we're going to simplify the process and hopefully make it possible for more people who are interested in being living donors, but fear the very real financial implications and know that they can get the reimbursement that they deserve. There are other legislative concepts in the works, and I hope one of your takeaways from this slide and prior slides is that Congress really is paying attention to our organ and transplantation system. They want to see it do better, and they're raising their hands on a bipartisan basis to help. Let's take another pause and recap. I hope by this point, you all have kind of started to reach the same conclusion that the ASN leadership and I have, which is that the federal government's stated goals for transplant policy reform actually look a lot like the goals we've been advocating for. Good governance and accountability, transparency for patients and their families, aligning the government agencies so they're all working in sync to better meet patients' needs, increasing how we use our organ supply and support living donors, and adopting modern technology. Let's all be real. Goals are not guarantees, but this is a promising start that I hope you're all as excited about as we are. And just recently, this dude, the President of the United States, actually came out and declared that improving the organ transplantation system is a priority for this administration. And that's huge, that is amazing, but what I think is even better is that this has actually been a priority across the last 3 administrations, starting under President Obama, who convened the first White House Organ Summit, Moving on to President Trump, who made a number of changes to other aspects of the transplant system through the Advancing American Kidney Health Executive Order, and now President Biden with the OPTN Modernization Initiative and other activities too numerous to name in a 45-minute talk today. Key takeaway here is that kidney health and transplantation are bipartisan goals in Washington. Rare, if I say so myself, bipartisan goals. And the cross-administration momentum is here to stay. So I'm nearing the end of my talk, I promise. And this is what I hope you all have distilled as the take-home messages. We have so much to be proud of in the US transplant system. It has made major accomplishments across the last many decades and helped tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of patients and their families. At the same time, we recognize that there are still opportunities to improve on that success moving forward into the 21st century. And many simultaneous changes, taking inspiration from that everything bagel, are actually starting to happen at once. And those changes are at least aiming at putting patients first. Again, the Modernization Initiative is a first set of reforms. It's definitely not the last, but we hope by doing some of these infrastructure things, governance changes, and orienting the system around innovation and new ideas, we'll position it to evolve even more in years to come. But one thing I know for certain is that these goals for reform will not fulfill their promise without your voice, the voice of patients, families, and caregivers. So what can you do? Well, inspired by the 5 ingredients from the Everything Bagel, I've got 5 takeaways for you here. And the first, there's a link. HRSA is actively seeking input on how you think the system can serve you better. I'll work with Isella to make sure this link is available to everyone afterwards, but tell them what you want to see. Tell them what's working, what's not working, your ideas for shaping it. Be ready to ask your congressional delegation to co-sponsor that HOLD Act as soon as it drops. I'm sure RSN will alert you. And if you haven't already gotten your members of Congress to sign on to the Living Donor Protection Act, do it or thank them. Everybody loves a thank you. Everybody loves an everything bagel. And consider joining us at ASN in calling for more government coordination across the Department of Health and Human Services through the formation of an Office for Kidney Health and Transplantation. And last but not least, and I really think this is the most important one of all, be positive about the potential for these changes to improve access. Change can be scary. Change needs all of us to get involved to help shape it to be the best that it can be. But change also represents an opportunity to build on our past successes and do things even better in the future to maximize patients' access and ensure that access is equitable. So hopefully I didn't talk for too long because I'm excited to hear your reactions, thoughts, questions, and I know many of you have posted them in the chat, which I wasn't totally able to keep up with.
That's okay. I have them all ready for you, Rachel. I can go ahead and filter them to you if you're ready.
Yeah, take it away, Isella. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for that awesome presentation. I love the bagel comparison. That was really fun. So the first question we have is from Shar in the chat. She says, over 10 years ago, I was advised how expensive post-transplantation will cost. I was told of a fund we can contribute to so we have extra funds. Is there a business or a financial institution that caters to this savings plan only for transplant patients and won't get dinged by SSI or Medicare?
Shar, man, talk about going straight to the heart of the issue. I'm so glad you raised this question. Let's just take a little step back here and acknowledge that finances are a very real barrier to access to transplant for a lot of patients. And I, for one, think that is wrong, particularly when we have the Medicare ESRD system set up with the express purpose of making transplant available to all patients. So let's start by acknowledging the fact that having to have access to a fund or a certain amount of resources or other monetary bibs and bobs being a barrier is not something that we should be standing for. To directly answer your question, I wish I knew of a specific fund that was specifically geared towards helping patients in that post-transplant period. What I can say is that in the last decade, there have been a number of growing options, for some patients, with more states expanding access to Medicaid. For some people, that's an option. But again, we don't want anybody to have to spend down their assets just to qualify for Medicaid. That is incredibly perverse. So that's not a perfect solution. There are subsidies through the ACA that are available to people on a sliding scale. So for some individuals, by accessing a secondary plan in addition to your Medicare on the marketplaces, that can provide some additional support for things like copays post-transplant. But again, that's also not a perfect solution. Some, marketplace plans are pricey. They don't work for everyone. And for some people, if you live in a state where Medigap is an option, that's another plan you could explore to supplement your primary Medicare insurance. Again, I want to acknowledge, I don't think any of these are perfect solutions. But one of the challenges from a policy perspective is that we don't fully understand the ways in which, I'm just going to call these socioeconomic barriers, are creating barriers for patients, in part because different transplant centers have different ways they assess a patient's financial health. Would love to get a little more transparency on that, speaking of transparency. And we also don't collect any information about patients in that pre-waitlisting process. So once you've been referred, before you make the waitlist, there are a host of things that get looked at, including financial readiness. So we don't know how many people would face a financial barrier and not make the waitlist because of that. These are things I'm keenly interested in exploring so we can come up with policy solutions to help all those patients overcome those types of barriers. I wish that was a more satisfying answer, Shar, but again, I think you went straight to the heart of one of the, dirty little secrets about our transplant system that we should all be talking more about.
Thank you for your answer, Rachel. And we have another question from Pepe in our Q&A. He wants to know, can you give us any insight into the development of an artificial kidney? What is the extent of ASN's and the government's support and financing of artificial kidney development?
I am so glad you asked, Pepe. So a few years ago, I actually had the privilege of being instrumental in brokering the formation of KidneyX, a public-private partnership between ASN and the United States federal government. So we as ASN have contributed $25 million to this partnership, and we've secured, I think, about $25 million in appropriations from the United States Congress to match that. And the whole point of KidneyX is to identify promising innovators out there focused on an artificial kidney in particular, but other areas too, to jumpstart their work. I'll try to multitask and put a link to KidneyX's website, or maybe you could help me with that. I sell it in the link. But
sure.
For the last few years, KidneyX has funded a number of promising innovators who are working on wearable kidneys, implantable kidneys, bioartificial kidneys, xenotransplantation. So kind of the whole spectrum of next-gen artificial kidneys, I guess I would call them. There are, I'm sure you all read in the news, there are some other really exciting advancements in xenotransplantation that have been announced in recent months. And an initiative that we as ASN are currently working on is starting to lay the groundwork with Medicare to make sure that as those therapies come forward in the coming years, there is both coverage and payment to make them accessible to patients. Because it really doesn't do any good for anyone if we have these therapies, but they're only accessible to a select few.
We just want to thank you for your time and for being here and giving us such a great presentation.
And a shout out to our corporate mission partners for making this happen.